Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 12 quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, like many of us have witnessed this offseason, the meta of fantasy football has shifted. Quarterbacks are flying off draft boards, and the days of being able to wait till the 9th round and still acquire a top 8 quarterback are long gone. A line has been drawn in the sand. It's either you're selecting an early quarterback that is going to help you win a fantasy football championship, or you're waiting and just hoping that the rest of your team can compensate for the loss that you have at the quarterback position. Like I mentioned earlier this week in my early round draft strategies video, the influence of college football has been apparent on the NFL. The ability for these quarterbacks to not only get it done through the air, but on the ground with the rushing efforts of Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Justin Fields, Daniel Jones on a weekly basis. That influx of fantasy points is the separator between an elite level talent and quarterbacks that are sitting in the pocket and you're hoping are able to throw for 35 touchdowns in a singular season, which over the course of the past 3 have been very uncommon. I mean, just looking at the potential upside that we have seen from quarterbacks in the last 3 seasons, from 2020 to 2022, we have witnessed 14 different quarterback performances that have surpassed 350 fantasy points in a singular season. Now, when you go ahead and just consider 3 years, 14 performances, okay, that's a pretty good consistent slate. But when you look at 2004 to 2019, throughout that 16 season span, we only had 16 quarterback performances surpass 350 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. It comes to no surprise as to why the quarterback position is valued so highly, and as we continue into the 2023 season, it will maintain as such with the mobility of quarterbacks dominating the position. Now, before we get into today's content, as I'll be able to talk to you guys about my top 12 quarterback rankings, sharing with you guys statistics and of course facts regarding these players as we approach the season in order to give you guys the most informed decisions as you approach your 2023 fantasy football drafts. For those of you who are trying to get an upper hand on your league in regards to those drafts, be sure to go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy. Not only will you be able to draft there and get more mock draft experience prior to your draft, by signing up today using promo code Andrew and making a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you're not only going to set yourself up with a first-time deposit match, but you're also going to receive my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, which includes hundreds of hours of data and research that I've collected on the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions, which also includes my 2023 fantasy football draft rankings at all the primary positions, including kickers and defenses, top 200 flex for half PPR and full PPR rankings by tier, everything you could possibly imagine to help you win a 2023 fantasy football championship. But the rankings don't stop there. After you go ahead and make that first time deposit after using code Andrew, minimum of $10, you'll get my fantasy football draft rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, which will include by position, by tier, all the primary positions, including flex, half PPR, and full PPR. Help me help you for this upcoming season. Do yourself a solid. Check out the link down in the description. For those of you who are wondering whether you're eligible to sign up and draft via Underdog today, go ahead and use the map to the right to figure out your eligibility and draft responsibly. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into talking about our top 12 quarterback rankings, beginning with my number 1, Josh Allen. Now, if that Cincinnati Bengals game last season wasn't canceled, Josh Allen would have been the number 1 overall ranked quarterback for a 3rd consecutive season for fantasy football. Not only that, he's been able to put up 395 or more fantasy points in each of the last 3 seasons. And when you look at fantasy football history at the quarterback position, no other quarterback has been able to put up that many points that frequently in their entire careers. The next best is Patrick Mahomes with 2 of those performances, Peyton Manning with 1, Aaron Rodgers with 1, and Lamar Jackson with 1. While Josh Allen sits up there with 3. He's an incredible overall talent. And since 2020, he's been averaging 24.35 fantasy points per game in the last 49 regular season games that he's participated in. And of those 49 games, 42 of those games have consisted of 2 or more touchdowns scored, which is an 86% rate. Now, when we go ahead and isolate the 2022 season, and we talk about Ken Dorsey taking over as offensive coordinator and Brian Daboll taking his services to become the head coach of the New York Giants, many of us were worried last season that that would make an impact on Josh Allen. And to be totally honest, it did. It made a positive impact. From weeks 1 through 9 of the 2022 season, Josh Allen was the number 1 overall quarterback, and he was averaging 26.92 fantasy points per game. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention that span of time is because after that, he hurt his elbow. And from weeks 10 through 18, even though Josh Allen was still the number 2 overall quarterback in fantasy football throughout that span of time, throughout those 8 games, he was averaging only 22.53 fantasy points per game. So pretty much a 3.5 fantasy point per game drop in terms of averages on a per week basis, which is pretty significant, but so was his elbow injury, so it all makes sense. But now that we approach the 2023 season with an offense that is elite, again, since 2020, the Buffalo Bills, in terms of touchdowns per game on average are number one amongst all teams in the National Football League, just slightly ahead of the Kansas City Chiefs. This is an offense that since 2020, in terms of per game averages, is number 5 in passing attempts, number 6 in passing completions, number 4 in passing yards, and number 3 in passing touchdowns. I mentioned this regarding Stephon Diggs in yesterday's video. Josh Allen has had a minimum of 4,200 passing yards and 35 passing touchdowns in each of the last 3 consecutive seasons. So yes, he can get it done through the air, but he's got his rushing abilities as well. In the last 3 seasons, he's averaging about 121 rushing attempts, 675 rushing yards, and 7 rushing touchdowns a season. On average, that's about 110 fantasy points per year in terms of an extra boost to his overall potential, which makes him such a valuable prospect in fantasy football. Now, for those of you who are thinking that Josh Allen is not going to run the ball as much this year, as they bring in Latavius Murray, as they bring in Damian Harris to run the ball, and they're going to shy away from getting him into exposed situations, which he could potentially get hurt, I understand and I respect that perspective, but the current situation with Josh Allen, especially looking at the last 3 seasons of his rushing yard totals, 62% of his rushing yards were accumulated off of scrambles and 38% were accumulated off of design runs. So even if you go ahead and eliminate half of those design run percentages in terms of yards, on a per year basis, it's about 120 yards less, which is 12 fantasy points, not a huge deal. I really don't think it's going to impact him much, as majority of Josh Allen's value is found on the goal line, having scored 19 red zone rushing touchdowns in just the last 3 seasons alone. In terms of consistency, he's one of the best at the position. Therefore, he's my number 1. Let's move on to our number 2. We have Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes has been a top 4 quarterback in each of the last 3 seasons. Last season, he was the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football, and he was breaking records, to say the very least, whether it was in the NFL, setting the record for most total yards in a singular season. Obviously, a 17th regular season game helps, but he put together 5,608 total yards, passing and rushing combined. Pretty ridiculous stat. But not only that, he broke a record for fantasy football, being the first quarterback ever to surpass 400 fantasy points in 2 separate seasons. Unbelievable statistics. We know he's one of the best in the league, and that's why he's my number 2 going into this season. Since 2020, he's averaged 23.52 fantasy points per game in the last 49 games that he's played during the regular season. 39 of those games consisting of 2 or more total touchdowns, which is an 80% success rate. Going into the 2023 year, it doesn't matter that Juju Smith-Schuster or Mecole Hardman are no longer a part of the team. I mean, they lost Tyreek Hill going into the 2022 season, and Patrick Mahomes had one of the best seasons of his career despite the loss of Tyreek Hill, who's a Hall of Fame potential wide receiver. It's absolutely ridiculous to witness what this offense has put together, but it's just been consistency over the years. I mean, since 2020, this team leads all teams in the National Football League in total touchdowns scored with 165 offensively. Pretty ridiculous number. Not only that, they're number 3 in terms of total passing attempts, number 2 in passing completions, number 1 in passing yards, and number 1 in passing touchdowns throughout that span of time. I don't believe I have to sell you on Patrick Mahomes' passing ability. He demonstrates that every Sunday. But what he does with his legs is phenomenal. Being able to average an influx of about 53 fantasy points over the course of the last 3 seasons on average is incredible. Averaging 66 rushing attempts, 363 rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns a season. That overall contribution of fantasy points just continues to creep him towards the top and potentially may have him being the number 1 overall fantasy quarterback this upcoming season. But I have him at number 2 as I slightly prefer the consistency and upside that Josh Allen presents. Let's move on to our number 3. Speaking of consistency, we have Jalen Hurts here as our number 3. Last season, he finished as the number 3 overall quarterback, but from weeks 1 through 15, he was the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football, averaging 26.4 fantasy points per game. He was absolutely unstoppable prior to his injury, and that's been a reoccurring thing. The last 2 seasons has had a shortened season due to the fact that he has gotten injured late. So hopefully he can avoid all of that, and if he could potentially do so, he could very easily, similar to Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes, be the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football in 2023. And there's a reason why these 3 guys that are on screen are being drafted before the end of our 3rd round of our fantasy drafts, because they have so much potential. Now, when we talk about Jalen Hurts, over the course of the last 2 seasons, averaging about 23.01 fantasy points per game in the last 30 regular season healthy games that he has played. 22 of those games consisting of 2 or more touchdowns, which is a 72% rate. Of course, we know that Jalen Hurts had a huge uptick in terms of his passing ability this last season. You go ahead and add an A.J. Brown to the overall offense, it's going to make it that much easier for him to develop as a quarterback and show everybody what he's capable of. And the improvement didn't just stop with them, as Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert both posted incredible seasons last year, an elite overall offense. But yes, Passing game, fantastic. Anything that Jalen Hurts is able to accumulate in that regard, we'll take. Him having 2 1,000-yard receiving options last season, fantastic. If they can continue that into 2023, the sky's the limit. But what he can do on the ground is what separates him. When we isolate the rushing averages that Jalen Hurts has posted over the course of the last 2 seasons and spread them across a 17-game season, he would potentially produce 172 rushing attempts, 875 rushing yards, and 13 rushing touchdowns in an average season, assuming he plays a full 17-game stretch, which is 165.5 fantasy points. Unbelievable influx of potential just off of rushing statistics alone. On top of it, when we've looked at what he's accumulated over the course of the last 2 seasons, 49% of his rushing yards have been from scrambles and 51% off designed runs. Again, a lot of those design runs being 4th and 1 QB sneaks, goal line, QB sneaks that are getting him incredible fantasy point influxes, but that's just how this offense is set up. They're going to run the ball through Jalen Hurts. There's a reason why he secured such a massive contract this offseason. I mean, just looking at the last 2 seasons alone, he has had himself 20 red zone rushing touchdowns. An incredible number that is only going to continue to stay consistent as long as this offense is predicated on him finding success in the running game and, of course, punching it in when they get close to the goal line, especially considering they no longer have Miles Sanders this upcoming season. It's pretty easy to do when you're behind the number 1 ranked offensive line, and especially one of the best, if not the best centers in the National Football League in Jason Kelce. I think Jalen Hurts got himself a perfect position to once again repeat as a top 3 quarterback if he can stay perfectly healthy and not miss a singular game, and we're not going to see any sort of hangover from the Super Bowl loss. Jalen Hurts, at very base minimum, is our number 3 quarterback. Moving on, let's talk about Lamar Jackson, our number 4. Speaking of injuries, Lamar Jackson has found himself each of the last 2 years having his season cut short and ranking as the number 14 and number 16 ranked quarterback, despite only playing about 11 games each of those seasons healthy, which is obviously not a great number, but still, that if he's only playing 11 regular season games and still ranking as a quarterback within the top 16, how valuable he is. Anytime he's been able to play 15 or more games in a season, he's a top 10 quarterback easily. We know that he's put together legendary performances and he's capable of rushing for 1,000 yards in a singular season. He's just got to stay healthy and ready to go. And hopefully, by keeping him in the pocket and changing the offensive coordinator from Greg Roman to Todd Monken, we're going to see the passing game develop and elevate this entire Baltimore Ravens offense, and specifically the efforts of Lamar Jackson in fantasy football. So let's talk about what Lamar Jackson has been able to produce prior to his injuries each of the last 2 years. In 2021, from weeks 1 through 13 prior to his injury, was the number 7 ranked quarterback, averaging 21.71 fantasy points per game throughout that 11-game stretch. Last season, from weeks 1 through 12, he was the number 5 overall ranked quarterback, averaging 21.34 fantasy points per game throughout that 11-game stretch. So in the last 22 games, averaging about 21.5 fantasy points per game. Pretty good overall statistics, to say the least. But we know what his upside potential is. We know that he can be a quarterback that could score 25 fantasy points per week easily. We know that he could have a game where he throws for 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, and additionally has 100 rushing yards under his belt. The potential is there. Whether he can stay on the field is the biggest determining factor. And I understand there is risk implied when drafting Lamar Jackson in our 2023 leagues. But you just have to understand that the risk sometimes is worth the reward, especially when we take into account his rushing averages over the last 3 seasons. If you spread them across a 17-game season, that's about 184 rushing attempts, leading to 1,159 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns a season. 152 fantasy points, very close to Jalen Hurts. The question is, can Lamar Jackson close the gap in the passing game? And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, hopefully Todd Monken is going to help him get there. Todd Monken used to be the offensive coordinator of the Georgia Bulldogs, the national champions this last season. He also was in the NFL and was the offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2018 and the Cleveland Browns in 2019. In 2018, with Jameis Winston, they threw the ball the 4th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League that season, and they had the most passing yards and the 3rd most passing touchdowns. They let it rip with Jameis Winston, and hopefully they'll let that happen with Lamar Jackson, even if you have Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews on the field, in comparison to having a 11 personnel set. Running 12 personnel is not going to hurt you. You have those big bodies crossing the middle. That's exactly what Lamar Jackson prefers. But they went an even step further to go ahead and ensure that Lamar Jackson and the passing game is going to develop by bringing in, Nelson Aguilar, Odell Beckham Jr. You'll have a healthy Rashad Bateman, and they also drafted Zay Flowers. I think there's a high potential for Lamar Jackson to be a consistent quarterback and, of course, meet this top 4 standing by season's end. Moving on, let's talk about Justin Fields, another one of these mobile quarterbacks. He became the third quarterback in NFL history to surpass 1,000 rushing yards in a singular season. Absolutely unbelievable. That was all while the Chicago Bears posted historic numbers in terms of being awful in the passing game. Last season, the Chicago Bears put up the fewest NFL team passing attempts since the 2004 Pittsburgh Steelers. That was when Big Ben was a rookie. Just putting that into perspective. Now, there are two sides to the coin with Justin Fields. There's Justin Fields from weeks 1 through 4 of last season, and then there's Justin Fields from weeks 5 through 18. Weeks 1 through 4, the guy was averaging 8.5 passing completions per game and was averaging 9.39 fantasy points per game throughout that stretch of time, was the number 35 overall ranked quarterback. Awful play. But after he got a little bit more comfortable and they allowed him to run the ball on design runs and really get himself implemented in this offense, from weeks 5 through 17 was averaging 23.49 fantasy points per game throughout that 11-game stretch, and was significantly better whether it was on the ground or through the air. His passing completion percentage increased 13% from weeks 1 through 4 comparatively to 5 through 17. Incredible numbers. And now that you get Justin Fields in an additional season under the same offensive coordinator, getting more comfortable, you bring in DJ Moore to elevate the passing game. I think there's a very good chance that Justin Fields takes another step forward. We've seen year 3 quarterbacks find themselves success, especially when you add a potential wide receiver piece that is going to elevate their game. We're talking about Dak Prescott with Amari Cooper, Kyler Murray with DeAndre Hopkins, Jared Goff with Brandon Cooks, Josh Allen with Stephon Diggs. Even last season, Jalen Hurts getting the addition of A.J. Brown, or Tua getting the addition of Tyreek Hill. When you add a premium wide receiver, and sure, DJ Moore isn't of the caliber of a Tyreek Hill or a Stephon Diggs. I understand that, but being able to just give Justin Fields anything in the receiving game is going to elevate his play, because we know he's going to get it done on the ground. I mean, this is a guy that last season quite literally had 33 rushes of 10 or more yards, which was 5th amongst all running backs or quarterbacks in the National Football League last year, with 50 rushing attempts minimum. We know he's going to be a fantastic option. And when we take the averages that he was producing from weeks 5 through 17 of last year, and you spread them across a 17-game season, there's a potential for Justin Fields to even surpass 400 fantasy points, because the averages that he produced last season would have left him at 393.41 total fantasy points. The potential is certainly there. I absolutely believe that Justin Fields is ready to accomplish and take that step forward. That's why he's my number 5. Moving on to number 6, we have Justin Herbert, another Justin that we wanted to mention. So here's the thing about Justin Herbert. In terms of his first 3 seasons of his NFL career, he's number 1 amongst all quarterbacks in NFL history in terms of total passing yards with 1,489. Pretty ridiculous statistic. Last season led the NFL in terms of total passing attempts with 699, which was 4th in NFL history in terms of a regular season total passing attempts by a team. Pretty ridiculous statistic there. Since 2020, since becoming the starting quarterback of the Los Angeles Chargers, he's averaged 20.26 fantasy points per game in the last 49 contests, 31 of those contests consisting of 2 or more touchdowns total, which is a 63% success rate. When we take into account what exactly Justin Herbert had to deal with last season and why he wasn't as incredible as we anticipated him to be, his offensive line was damaged quickly. Left tackle was out, and rest of that offensive line, especially Corey Linsley, which is a former Pro Bowl center. I mean, when you get 2 of your best offensive linemen down early in the season, and they did not return for quite a while, and then the rest is just a complete carousel of changing every single week. When your offensive line is not stable, of course, you're not going to be stable. Additionally, he had that rib cartilage injury. Later on in the season, he also had a shoulder injury. Not only that, his primary 2 receiving options, Mike Williams, missed 5 games. Keenan Allen essentially missed 9 games last season. You bring in Quentin Johnston this upcoming offseason by drafting him. You have a healthy offensive line, healthy receiving core, healthy Justin Herbert. I believe the number 6 overall quarterback is a very achievable overall number for Justin Herbert. And not only can he get it done through the air, he can certainly do it on the ground. Like I mentioned, I always want my quarterbacks to have rushing upside. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, when you take his averages, he's averaging about 60 rushing attempts per season, along with 237 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, which is about 42 fantasy points that are influx just off rushing statistics alone. If we go ahead and take 42 fantasy points and try to equate that to passing statistics, that's an additional 10 passing touchdowns that he's gathering just off of his legs alone. Now, I understand the offensive coordinator change is going to be different. This is going to be a new offense for Justin Herbert going into the season. But you got to remember, Kellen Moore, formerly of the Dallas Cowboys, the offensive coordinator there, helped elevate that offense to having the 5th most passing attempts, fifth most passing completions, fifth most passing yards, and seventh most passing touchdowns since 2019. The Dallas Cowboys offense, in terms of total offensive touchdowns, 48 in 2019, 39 in 2020, obviously with Dak Prescott hurt there. In 2021, 55 offensive touchdowns, and last season, 52. All of those years in which Dak Prescott was healthy, they've always been in the top 6 in terms of offensive total touchdowns since 2019. I think there's a very good likelihood that Justin Herbert meets the potential that we anticipated him to meet last season and continue to improve. You got to remember, Dak Prescott, underneath the Kellen Moore offense, has been the number 2 ranked quarterback at times and the number 7. I think 6 is perfect for Justin Herbert. Moving on, let's talk about the second half of the quarterback conversation. But before I talk about my number 7 quarterback, I do want to remind you, for those of you who want to stay up to date on my latest rankings, again, and want more information regarding the quarterback position and potentially quarterback consistency and all of that, you got to check out Underdog Fantasy. Be sure to go ahead, use promo code Andrew today, make that first time deposit of $10 minimum, because not only are you going to get that first time deposit match, you're going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, the rankings that are included in it. I'm telling you, the fantasy football draft guide has hundreds, if not thousands of hours of data and research collected for the singular purpose of trying to help you win on draft night. Of course, you can't win your league, but you can certainly lose it. So we were trying to set you up for success with not only the guide itself to give you an understanding as to how we've come to our conclusions and how you should approach your drafts, but of course, give you those rankings from the offseason into the entirety of the regular season every Sunday to help you guys out. So go ahead, check that out today. Use promo code Andrew, link in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to our number 7 quarterback. We have Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow has been the most accurate passing quarterback over the course of the last 2 seasons. In terms of his passing completion percentage, the only quarterback that is essentially even close has been Geno Smith based on his contributions last season. But otherwise, Joe Burrow sits at the very top of this list alone. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, he's been able to average 20.78 fantasy points per game throughout the 38 regular season games he's participated in. Of course, 26 of those games consisting of 2 or more total touchdowns. That's an 81% rate, of course, significantly higher than many other quarterbacks. But as we go ahead and we approach the 2023 season, I understand many people are worried about the calf injury. I believe he'll be ready. Again, it's early August. They don't play until September 10th. He'll be fully healthy, and once he is, he's going to be able to take over and dominate the league, because since 2021, the Cincinnati Bengals have been the number 4 team in terms of total offensive touchdowns per game, averaging 3.06 over the course of the last 2 seasons. On top of that, last season, the Cincinnati Bengals offense were number 10 in terms of total passing attempts as an offense, that led to being the number 7 team in passing yards and number 8 team on a per game basis in passing touchdowns. And that was all while Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both missed about 3 to 5 games of pop. So if you have your 2 primary receiving options out of the game, you also had Mixon missing time last season, you also had Hayden Hurst missing time last season, Joe Burrow with a fully healthy team surrounding him, assuming he's healthy, should be incredible. And even with offensive line improvements every season, their offensive line still sucks. In comparison to all quarterbacks last season, Tom Brady and Joe Burrow were at the very bottom of the list in terms of average time to throw. They had to get the ball out of their hands extremely quickly. But that's perfectly fine. Joe Burrow has still found success in doing so and been very accurate with that. Not only that, he's been able to accumulate yardage on the ground despite having that torn ACL back in 2020. This is a quarterback last season that had 257 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. That's a 56 fantasy point influx. His consistency is certainly going to be there. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, has been the number 6 overall quarterback in terms of my consistency calculator that is included in my 2023 fantasy football draft guide. So go ahead and check that out. Thank you very much. All right, moving on. We have Trevor Lawrence as our number 8. Trevor Lawrence, his rookie season, it was an absolute disaster. Urban Meyer as the head coach, everything from that season can just be erased and washed. We don't really want to remember anything, because what Doug Peterson has been able to do with his team since taking over has been significant. Last season, Trevor Lawrence only averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game throughout that 16-game stretch. Only 8 of those games consisting of 2 or more total touchdowns, 50% rate. We understand that, but I truly do believe we are only going to get more and more improvement from Trevor Lawrence. Again, he was touted as someone coming out of the college football game as the next Andrew Luck, as the number 1 overall pick, someone who was going to save the Jaguars organization, and ended up helping them win a playoff game and potentially almost being, the Kansas City Chiefs this past season in the playoffs, obviously because Patrick Mahomes was dealing with some injuries there. But nonetheless, there's going to be significant improvement with Trevor Lawrence going into this upcoming season. Let's begin with talking about his rushing game. Considering his averages over the last 2 seasons have consisted of about 70 rushing attempts, 320 rushing yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns a year, he's obviously going to elevate his overall game because of those statistics alone. But then you go ahead and talk about how much of a elite passer he's potentially going to become alongside Doug Peterson, a guy who, in my opinion, is a quarterback whisperer. I mean, the the ability to be able to take Carson Wentz and almost make him an MVP, just short of that ACL injury. Carson Wentz was an MVP that year that the Eagles won a Super Bowl. I mean, even later that season, Doug Peterson was the quarterback whisperer that helped Nick Foles capture a Super Bowl for that Philadelphia Eagles organization. But now that you go into the 2023 year with more experience and you add Calvin Ridley, who back in 2020 was the number 3 overall fantasy wide receiver, a guy that had 90 receptions, nearly 1,400 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns that year. You add him into this offense, and you look at the history of success at elite quarterback play and quarterbacks entering their third year. We have seen quarterbacks like Burrow, Tua, Hurts, Allen, Mahomes, Goff, and Prescott. All of them have a following season as they approach their year 3 that consisted of higher statistics in every category and additionally a higher ranking in fantasy. Burrow went up 4 ranks, Tua went up 10, Hurts 6, Allen 5, Mahomes 3, Goff went up 5 ranks going into his third year, Prescott went up 1 rank. Now, if you talk about the statistics that they increase, it's about an 11% increase in passing yards, 18% in passing touchdowns, 10% in rushing yards, 10% in rushing touchdowns, and 11% in fantasy points, which would potentially lead to Trevor Lawrence and his potential from last season getting about 328 total fantasy points, which last season would have made him the number 5 overall quarterback. But going into this year, I see that number landing him as the number 8. Again, let's not forget, the addition of Calvin Ridley cannot be understated. Calvin Ridley back in 2020 was the number 1 overall receiving option in terms of deep receiving production, 20 or more yards down the field, was number 1 in targets, receptions, 2 in yards, and was an absolute machine in that category. Last season, Lawrence threw the 5th most deep passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field. You add a premier wide receiver with him, he should be fantastic. Moving on to Deshaun Watson as our number 9. I think Deshaun Watson is the line in the sand in my mind, the proverbial line in the sand in terms of the separation being quarterbacks 1 through 8 are the quarterbacks that I truly believe can help win me a fantasy football championship this upcoming season, while rankings 9 through 12 and beyond, they'll get the job done, but the rest of my team, considering I'm not utilizing high draft capital for quarterback at that position, the rest of my team better be able to carry me to the promised land, right? So let's talk about Deshaun Watson. Over the course of the last 3 seasons where he has been a starting quarterback for the entire of the season, so that'd be 2018, 19, and 20, he was a top 5 quarterback in every single one of those years. Last season, once he took over the starting quarterback position, only averaged 14.26 fantasy points per game in comparison to his 2020 efforts, where he was averaging 23.08 fantasy points per game, which is elite levels of production. We know that the Cleveland Browns as an offense is not going to throw the ball a bunch. Since 2020, they've thrown the ball in comparison to all teams in the National Football League, the 28th most times. They're in the bottom 4 in that category, which is really not a surprise considering how much success they find in the running game and behind Nick Chubb. But with that being said, there were seasons in which Baker Mayfield, back in 2020, had himself 3,500 passing yards and 26 passing touchdowns. There is no way that Deshaun Watson won't be capable of accomplishing, at base minimum, those statistics, and on top of it, having the ability to run the ball. From 2017 through 2020, if we take his per game averages rushing and we expand them upon a full season, we're talking about 500 plus rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns on average coming this season for Deshaun Watson, assuming, of course, he still has his legs under him and he's willing to scramble and make design runs and at times find himself in the end zone in those goal line scenarios. I do believe that Deshaun Watson is surrounded by one of the most, if not the most talented team that he's had in his career. He's just got to show up and show that, yeah, last season, when I came back from my suspension, it was all a fluke. I'm ready to get back to it. And the number 9 spot should be a safe draft spot for Deshaun Watson at bare minimum. Moving on, let's talk about number 10, Dak Prescott. Dak Prescott, as long as he has been healthy and he's never missed a game in his career, in those seasons, he has always been a top 12 ranked quarterback in fantasy football. From 2019 through 2022, in the 47 healthy games he's played throughout the regular season, he averaged 20.74 fantasy points per game, 33 of those games consisting of 2 or more touchdowns. That's a 70% success rate, which is fantastic. Not only has he been able to get it done through the air, especially with Kellen Moore helping him as the offensive coordinator since 2019, leading this team to the 5th most passing attempts, 5th most passing completions, 5th most passing yards, and 7th most passing touchdowns. Of course, elevating Dak Prescott into being a top 2 quarterback in the 2019 season. We have seen a lot of success here through the air. But on the ground, even after his injury, there is still potential for Dak Prescott to get himself accumulating 200 rushing yards, probably a handful of rushing touchdowns, considering Zeke is no longer a part of this team. They're going to have the quarterback run the ball near the goal line for sure. I certainly think that Dak Prescott's probably going to shy away from just open field scrambles, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he's going to be able to accumulate 50 rushing attempts this upcoming year. Yes, he's a little bit less efficient. Maybe he's a little bit more hesitant, but 1 year removed from that injury, once again, leads him to a potential uptick in his overall statistics on the ground. Now, the absence of Kellen Moore is going to be significant as this team is going from Kellen Moore as our offensive coordinator who wants to light it up to someone like Brian Schottenheimer. But Brian Schottenheimer, the last time he was an offensive coordinator in this league was 2018 through 2020 with the Seattle Seahawks. And though they weren't throwing the ball a bunch there, those were the best seasons of Russell Wilson's entire career in terms of efficiency and consistency. And the fact that throughout 2018 through 2020, the Seattle Seahawks in terms of total offensive touchdowns were number 4 amongst all teams in the National Football League with 151 in 4 seasons offensively. I think there's a very good likelihood that the efficiency of this offense increases, even though they did lose Dalton Schultz this offseason through free agency. They did bring in Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks should be a fantastic wide receiver 2 option, which should elevate this offense going forward. Moving on, let's talk about Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones may be a surprise within my top 12. I think his rushing potential, his upside, the fact that I call him a discount Josh Allen is not by accident. Daniel Jones did enough in 1 season of his career last year to secure himself $160 million in a 4-year deal, while Saquon Barkley's over here trying to beg for just 1 extra million in comparison to what they were offering him with, of course, the franchise tag. But Daniel Jones last season averaged 18.06 fantasy points per game, 9 of those contests with 2 or more total touchdowns, which is a 56% success rate. Last season, 120 rushing attempts, 708 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns in 16 regular season games, which is 112.8 fantasy points or 7.05 fantasy points per game on average. Again, when you're getting an additional almost 2 passing touchdowns just off of your rushing statistics alone, anything he's able to do through the air, which significantly improved in 2022 in comparison to his, overall contributions in seasons past, it's fantastic. Now, when we consider the fact that last season, 429 of his rushing yards were scrambles and 274 were by design run, there's still going to be potential for him to take rushing touchdowns near the red zone away from Saquon Barkley. Those designs are definitely going to be drawn up. I mean, last season, he had 24 rushing attempts inside the 20-yard line that led to 6 rushing touchdowns, 7 of those rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line that led to 3 rushing touchdowns. So he's going to have the value there, similar to a Josh Allen. The reason why I compare the two is because Brian Daboll, of course, formerly of the Bills, now the head coach and play caller of the New York Giants, helping accentuate the, maximize potential of Daniel Jones and what he can do through the air and on the ground. But when we talk about Daniel Jones, and you see what this team has kind of surrounded him with, this is still a run-first team. They literally ran the ball just as much as they passed it last season, 520 passing attempts and rushing attempts. They're going to continue to lean upon the running game. And of course, as being a mobile quarterback, he'll continue to dominate in that factor. But he really hasn't had a number 1 receiving option throughout his entire career. While some of these other quarterbacks like Tua got Tyreek, Jalen Hurts got A.J. Brown, Josh Allen got Stephon Diggs, Kyler Murray got DeAndre Hopkins, Daniel Jones got Kenny Golladay a couple years ago. And Kenny Golladay was an absolute disaster for that organization. They lost a lot of money on that investment. But hopefully bringing in Darren Waller as the primary number 1 pass catcher of this offense is going to make a difference. A guy that in 2019 consisted of 90 receptions within that Raiders offense, and in 2020 was with 107 receptions on 145 targets. In terms of his catch rate, extremely high. And if he can immediately make an impact on this team, it'd be fantastic. Especially when you consider the Giants pass catchers last season had a 7.8% drop rate, which was the 4th worst amongst all teams in the National Football League last year. If you improve the receiving options that surround him, bringing in Paris Campbell, bringing in Jamison Crowder, I don't know how much those guys are going to play, but if you just bring in more talent, it's only going to help Daniel Jones, who had an 81.1% adjusted passing completion percentage last season. You surround him with talent, you're going to find success. Moving on. Let's talk about Tua Tagovailoa as our final quarterback. Tua Tagovailoa, it took him 3 seasons for this team, this organization, to surround him with, a pretty decent offensive line, with talent finally around him in the receiving position, and an actual good head coach. Mike McDaniel instantly elevated this team. And we saw last season as Tua in his healthy games, the 10 healthy games he participated in, was averaging 20.67 fantasy points per game. 6 of those 10 games, 60% success rate, consisting of 2 or more total touchdowns. When we take the averages that Tua produced in those 10 healthy games and expand them upon a 17-game season, he was on pace for 5,001 passing yards and 39 passing touchdowns, which would lead, based on the averages that he accumulated in interceptions, which would have led to 7, and rushing yards that would have led to 119, about 351 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. A part of an offense that, again, is accelerating towards being one of the more pass-happy threats in the National Football League. I think there's a very high potential that Tua could very easily be a QB1, especially when he's throwing the ball to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and they're doing majority, if not all, the work. Jalen Waddle had 521 yards after the catch last season, which was 10th amongst all receiving options, and Tyreek Hill had 487, which was 15th amongst all receiving options last season. When the top 2 receiving options of your offense are gaining you an additional 1,000 yards by just them getting, yardage after the catch, it's incredible. It is doing Tua major favors, but he's also been able to expand upon his game with better receiving threats surrounding him. Last season was number 1 amongst all quarterbacks with an 8.87 yard per attempt average, and number 2 amongst all quarterbacks with a 10.1 average depth of target. He's throwing the ball downfield. Again, like I've mentioned in seasons past, he is pretty decent in terms of his deep ball. Last season had the 3rd most deep ball passing completions of 20 or more yards down the field, which led to the 4th most deep passing yards and 6th most deep passing touchdowns amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League. Based on the way that the Miami Dolphins are constructed as a team, they're going to continue to throw the ball more. They're going to continue to lean upon Tua Tagovailoa to carry this team with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. They got rid of Mike Gesicki. That's fine because they didn't really utilize the tight end position anyway. And the rushing threats that they have all have the ability to catch the ball. This is an offense that going into 2023 may be a little bit less efficient in their opportunities, but with the way that that defense looks, if that defense is able to, cause some turnovers, you're going to have some opportunities on some short fields, and being able to take advantage of that with Tua's arm certainly will be the case. That's going to cover it in terms of my top 12 quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Again, if you're trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to check out my draft guide. You can either find it on Patreon and or by going ahead, checking out Underdog Fantasy, using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of $10. You're going to get my draft guide, my rankings throughout the offseason and into the regular season. So go ahead, do yourself a favor. Let me help you win a 2023 fantasy football championship. Until tomorrow, I'll be talking about Superflex quarterback league draft strategies. Again, if you don't play in a Superflex league, you got to do yourself a favor and join one this season, giving you guys some perspective as to how to draft and how to approach it with strategies that I have found a lot of success with over the years. So until next time, thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below, and I'll see you guys. Peace.